Hello Agilers and welcome back for another vlog where we'll provide first look for another new enhancement provided with AgilePoint NX version 9. Scope variable activities. Before we jump into it, kindly note that scopes and mainly the use cases for using the new scope variable activities are typically related with more complex type processes. As such, we'll start with some background explanation for scopes. If you are familiar and understand scopes, feel free to skip this part. For the citizen developers amongst us, and as an analogy to simplify scope explanation, vision this house with different rooms. Each room is like a part of your process or application. Variable scopes is like the rule that determines which rooms can see or use a variable. As a sample, consider you have an air condition unit at the room and you turn it on. This air condition will be felt in this room, but not in other rooms. As such, it has the scope of a room. It is private for that room. On the other hand, consider now instead of the air conditioner in the room, you have a central shared air conditioning system at the house. When this is turned on, it is felt over all rooms in the house. It is in the house scope or shared scope, as it is shared by all rooms. Similarly, think about a room speaker versus an house audio control system. Same thing. Room speaker is private scope for the room, while the audio control system is at the house scope and shared. Again, this is just a simple analogy to simplify scope explanation, yet it is quite accurate. We use scopes at any level of our lives, and also when we design and build applications. For the developers amongst us, consider the following simple JavaScript code. We have a variable named sampleVar, which we set on the global level with the value global. We also set and initialize this value inside the function example function with the value local. Now when we use this variable inside the function, we use the function scoped variable and we'll get the value local, as we can see on the first line of the console output. Now when we use this variable outside of the function, we'll use the global scope of this variable and we'll get the global scope value global, as we can see on the second line output of the console output. AgilePoint is no different and uses scopes to distinguish between different parts of the application. The following slide shows the built-in scopes. At the bottom, which is the lowest level, we have the work item. Then on top of it we have the activity instance, on top of it we have process instance, and then work object, and then we have the global shared variable, which are on the level of an AgilePoint NX environment. When resolving variable, it will always start from the lowest or closest scope of the execution to the higher scope. This represents the hierarchy of AgilePoint. So let's have a look on it from an hierarchy perspective. In this slide, we can see the visual representation of the hierarchy within AgilePoint. At the bottom, we have the work item, which is an instance of an activity instance, which is part of a process. Each of these components has a unique ID, such as a work item ID, activity instance ID, process instance ID, etc., which uniquely identify them and is also used as an identifier for their scope. Some of these scopes has some known variables which can be found under the system data and commonly used within email templates, e-forms, etc. For example, we have the task ID, task participant username, and other task variables for the work item ID scope, activity name, activity display name, and other activity variables for the activity instance scope, and process ID, process name, and other process variables for the process instance scope. Here's a small hint to note. The variable prefix, task, activity, process, represents the scope it relates to. We can also see the work object ID, which is used to identify a chain or in hierarchy of processes. So by default, all processes in that chain will use the same work object ID and will share their variables. So in this sample, the parent process and the two sub-processes, sub-process 1 and sub-process 2, they all share the same work object ID, and by that they all share the same attributes. Also, very important to note that by default, any variable you create, such as a form field or process field, will be stored in the work object ID scope. To summarize, variables are always included within a scope. Work object ID is the default scope used for form and process variables, and by default is shared by a process chain, which allows sharing the variables across the chain by default. Other scopes include work item, activity instance, process instance, and the global or shared scope. Scopes are identified by some identifier. Mostly, this would be a general unique identifier type, such as a work object ID, process instance ID, etc., but it can be any string as long as it's unique, which enables you to create your own custom scope, such as application scope, region scope, department, etc. With AgilePoint NX version 9, two activities has been added: get scoped variables and set scoped variables. These activities will allow you to have more fine-grained control and isolate variables into different scope when and as needed, as well as create your own custom scopes. To use these new activities, and if you'd like to follow along with me on this demo, you'll need AgilePoint NX version 9. Following is the recipe we'll follow for this demo and overview. We'll start by review the new activities, we'll follow with running a simple usage demo, and lastly, we'll see this in action using a simplified high-level incident management application. So, let's get to it. So, I've moved into my AgilePoint NX version 9 environment, and let's start by review the new two activities. So, I'll jump into my app builder, and I have the simple usage flow for the demo, and let's review these two activities. Let's first open up the form and see what data it has to provide us. So it's a very simple form. It starts by first selecting the scope in which we want to store a variable with this name and with this value, and then we also have the loop back, so we can iterate back and forth on this activity to change the scope and change the value for this variable. So that's basically the form, quite simple. And then inside the flow we have a condition. First we check which scope we wanted to use to store the variable in, and if it's the work object ID scope, then we use the update process data activity, the traditional update process activity. So you should be familiar with that. Quite simple. You just provide the name of the variable and then the expression for its value, and it will be stored in the work object ID, because again the work object ID is the default scope being used to store any of your form or process data. This activity does not have the option to select in which scope. It will always store into the work object ID, and that's part of the reason why the new set scope activity has been added. Now if we want to store the variable inside the process instance ID, then we use the set scope activities. Okay, and this activity, it starts with a display name and then optional description. It's quite similar to the update process data with one exception. It has this, we have the option in here to select the scope in which we want to store the variables we provide. So we have the option to select the scope, and there is some built-in option, either it's the process instance ID or activity instance ID, or generate a new global unique identifier, generate a new scope ID. So it would be your own custom scope. You can also obviously select any of your form or application variable, drag and drop it in here, and this would be used for the scope, because again, scope can be any string. It's typically a general unique identifier type, but it can be any string eventually. Now again, we just store this variable. We will create or update a variable with this name and this value into that selected scope. And the scope I'm selecting in here, the first scope is the process instance ID. Next, if we want to store it in a custom scope, then again we use the set custom scope activity, the new activity, and this time I'm going to use a generate new GUID to create my own custom scope. Same thing in terms of the variable and the value, but just select a different scope using the generate new GUID. Now, if we are using the generate new GUID, or we are using any kind of a custom scope, in order to retrieve the value from that scope, we must use the get scope variable. Because if it's a custom scope, if it's not a built-in scope such as the process instance ID, then we must use the get scope variable. If it is one of the built-in scopes like the process instance ID, then the AgilePoint engine automatically knows how to read it. And again, keep in mind, the engine will always start from the closest or the lowest scope to the execution level, and will go up. It will go its way up from that level. But if it's a custom scope, then we must use this get scope variable, and that's one of the reasons why we added this activity together with the set scope activity. One thing to note, I just noticed I haven't said it yet, but these two activities has been added into the common activity library. You can see them at the bottom of the common activity library. Now let's open the get scope variable and see it. It's quite similar to the set scope, just the other way around. We have the option to select the scope. This time it's the scope where we will read the variable from, and the variable, actually again, this is the opposite way, because now this would be the variable we will read from that scope, and this would be the variable or a field in which we will store the value of this variable read from this scope. So we will store it in this variable so we can use it inside the application later on. And that's the get scope variable. It's quite simple. Now, once we have done with this, once we have set, I'm just sending an email so we can see the variable value we have. Okay, it's let's have a look at this email. Now we have two prints. One is for the current value of the work object ID / process instance ID, and then we print the value. Again, keep in mind I'm using the same variable name in all scopes. Okay. Now, if it's the work object ID or process instance ID, these two are built-in scopes. So AgilePoint will automatically know how to read from them, and it will again start from the closest, the nearest, the lowest scope, which is the process instance ID, and will search for an attribute with this name. And if it's not there, it will go one level up to the work object ID and will find an attribute with this name there. And if it's not there, it will go up to the shared and up until shared is the last scope. And if it's not there, then there would be no value retrieved, but that's the way it goes. It will always read from the lowest scope and will work its way out up from that level. On the other hand, if it's a custom scope, again, we must retrieve this using the get scope variable. And again, the get scope variable we used store the variable in this variable, and we print it in here. And that's basically it. That's the simple usage flow, and we can now run it and see how it works in action. So let's get to it. Let's head into the work center and instantiate a new process of this simple usage flow we just reviewed. So I'm going to head into my applications and then fire up this start form. And let's start by setting using the work object ID scope. and again the variable name would be my scope variable, and the value would be, let's use shared. And I'm going to loop back so we can again change to other scopes and different values, and let's hit the submit. And now I'm going to head into my work center and see the tasks. Okay, so I have a new task in here. We'll open up in a second to change the value, but let's also open the process viewer so we can see how it goes. Okay, so we just initiated. Again, we selected the work object ID, so we use the simple update process data activity, the traditional update process activity, and you can see that the email has been sent. You probably could have heard the email notification in the background, so let me jump into my inbox, and we can see that we got an email, scope variable simple usage, and the current value is shared. This is the current value I provided for this variable, my scope variable. Okay, so again it is stored in the work object ID and it has the value of shared. Now let's jump into the manage center. I would like to show you some other enhancement that came in with these two activities. Go into process runtime and then select filter. Let's search for by application name, and then we are going to look for this application scope variable and status running. Apply. Okay, so we have two instances in here. I'm looking on the last instance. So if we'll jump into the data, and now we go, first note that we don't have scope variable in here. Okay, but if I'll go into the process variable, as you can see, I have the my scope variable and it has the value of shared. This is the one we just created using the update process data. Okay, this one was created using this activity, the traditional standard update process data activity, which stores by default under the work object ID, and the information you see, both the form variable and the process variable, they both coming from the work object ID scope. Okay, so here is the value we have in the work object ID scope, just like as we seen in the email. So now I'm going to head back into my work center. I'm going to open this form again, and I'm going to change the scope this time to the process instance ID, and I'm going to change the value from shared to private. Okay, I have this autocomplete by the browser. Perfect. So I'm going to now have the value of private. I'm going to click the submit. Okay, so it will refresh in a second. Okay, as you can see, it looped again. This time it went through the set scope variable because we asked for the process instance ID, and it stored this value in the process instance ID. Now you have probably heard my inbox buzzing, so now you can see that the value is private from the process instance ID. Okay, now if I'll head back into the manage center and I'll refresh the data, now you can see that a scope variable, the manage center or this interface identified it. Now we have variables in the scope in the process instance level, so it now add and show us them in here. So we can see now that we have my scope variable with a value of private in the scope variable. Scope variable represent the process instance ID. Okay, and we still have the variable we set before, my scope variable, in the work object ID, and on the work object ID it still has the value of shared. Okay, so that's 2 out of 3. Now let's head back into the work center and fire up this form again, or open this form again. Oh, sorry, need to refresh. Now let's open it up. Okay, This time I'm going to use the custom scope, and I'm going to provide a name custom. Okay, and I'll submit. Now let's head into the monitor. It will refresh in a few seconds. You heard probably again, this time it's a custom, so it took this route. So it set the variable in a custom scope, and then it retrieved it from this custom scope and sent the email. So let's head back into the mail, see the last email came in. Now we can see that now we have value in the custom scope, and its value is custom. We still have the value in the process instance ID of scope, and if I'll head back into the manage center, if I'll refresh, there would be no new in here. Okay, again, the work object ID still has the myScope variable with the value of shared. The process instance ID still have the myScope variable in status of private, and custom scope would not be presented in here. Okay, the manage center, again, just like the engine, it knows to read from the built-in scopes. If you have your own custom scope, it will not be able to show them. You can create your own custom application to do that, obviously, but the manage center would not be able to show them by default. And that basically shows up and concludes the simple usage of this new activities. As you can see, we can use the set scope variable to store variable in either one of the built-in scopes, such as the process instance ID, or a custom scope that we generate automatically, or we just generate from intentionally, like, I don't know, department name or region. There are many type use cases which you can take, like an application and a threshold for a specific application. Each application has different threshold, and you can set a scope variable per application and create your own custom application scope to store this variable in. Again, there's many type of use cases for this, but the key point is just to understand how these activities are used and how you can operate them. It's quite simple and straightforward, and they're quite aligned with the traditional update process data, just that they have this option to select the scope in which you want to set or retrieve their attributes from. So that concludes the first simple usage demo. So now that we have seen the simple usage demo for the set scope variables to showcase these activities, how they work and function, let's have a look on a more realistic use case for these activities. For that, I'm gonna jump over this slide deck just to give a high level on what we are about to see. So we'll be seeing a simplified version of an incident management application which has a parent process which spins a few different sub-processes underneath it, and these sub-processes together with a parent process needs to share most of their variables and data, but needs to isolate privately some of the data because the sub-processes needs to have their own values for these variables, and they need to be independent, operating and working on them without affecting other processes or being affected by other processes changing them. And you can see two of these attributes in here. One is the required auditor. Some of them requires to have the value of yes, some of them require to have a value of no, and the other variable is SLA, and each process has its own SLA it needs to have. And again, this is a very common use case to be used by the set scope variable. And basically, again, it's when you need to isolate some of the variables across a chain of process hierarchy. So now that we have cleared that, let's go back into the flow, and I'm gonna head into my work center and spin a new incident management request. So I'm gonna head into my application and click on the start form of this application. Now again, this is a simplified version, so it only has what we need. Electricity socket exposed. It only has what we need for this showcase to focus on the use case itself for the set scope variables. So basically, I've seen something. I think it's dangerous. It's an incident. I want to report it. So I just open up this form and report it. In this case, I've seen electricity socket which has fallen, and some electricity wire are exposed in a dangerous manner. So I'm reporting this as an incident and submit. Now it will spin up a new incident management process, and I'm gonna head into my work center, into the task, and now I can see I have a new task waiting for me. And now I'm part of I'm wearing the hat of the incident management group member, and I'm gonna open up this form, and I can see what's the incident, and based on this incident, I'm gonna say, okay, we need first, we need Yaniv, myself, as an fix electric wire and socket. Okay, it will need 1 day SLA, and then we also need myself, this time as a contractor, fix the wall and socket. This will need, let's say, 2 days, and I'm gonna need another one. Guess who? Myself again. And this would be paint the wall. Once the wall has been fixed, then we'll need to paint the wall to make it look nice again. And let's say this one will need 3 days, and let's say the electricity will need an external auditor. So now I'm gonna submit this, and once I submitted this, then this will spin up a chain of processes, a process instance for each of these handlers, and each of them would need to have its own SLA based on the input I provided, and their own conditions, whether they require an external auditor, yes or no, and so on. So let's actually open up this viewer to see the flow. So that's the parent process. This is the submit of the request. This is now the incident, the form I just submitted, where I assign different handlers as the incident management group. And this now spin this sub process. Let's have a look on it. This sub process is just very technical, just looping over the handlers I provided, and for each of them it spins out this sub process. And if we'll go inside this sub process, then this is the process for each of the handlers, and in here we can see the set private variables, and this is where we setting the private variables, the SLA, the require auditor, and other attributes required to be private for this process, because it will need them down the road, and it needs to make sure they are privately owned by him as it go and check them and manipulate them, because otherwise other process instances, this flow, for instance, while it loop, it can change the variable and or other subprocesses may change the variables of this and can impact each other. And that's the use case. That's one of the use cases where we need the set scope variables, and using the set scope variables we can now easily using this activity just store this variable in a private scope of this instance without being concerned it will be manipulated or affected or changed by other processes. So now I can go into the manage center and search for these instances. Yeah, this is the process and running. Sorry. Yeah, running. Oh, come on. Okay, so now we can see that we have the parent process. This is the last one, the incident management. This is the parent, and we have 3 sub-processes, one for each of the rows: the electricity, the contractor, and the painter. And if I'll jump into the data of each of them, you can see that each of them has a scope variables, and the first one has the current require external auditor set to false. The assignee is myself in all cases, and this one has the SLA of 3. If I'll open up the second one, this would probably be the contractor. So again, it has the require external auditor set to false, and this one has the SLA of 2. And the third one is for the electricity. It has this time the current require auditor set to true, and the SLA is 1. So you can see that now each of them has its own private scoped attribute being isolated from each other, and they can store them and manipulate them, change them without affecting any of the others, or being concerned one of the others manipulation will change the SLA of other process. And that's again a very common use case where we need to use the set scoped variables. So with that, basically we conclude the video for these 2 new activities: set scoped variables and get scoped variables. Again, it typically relates to a more complex type processes. Obviously there's much more depth into it. We just touched based on the surface, but I think it shows the value of them, or it can show what you can do, and the additional level of control and fine-grained control you can get on which variables you store where, and isolate them and use different scope for the variables. I hope this was valuable for you and insightful, and you can see the value of these new activities and use them within your processes to make them smarter and better. Stay tuned for following videos, and thanks for your time.